So now that we have the ability to see the x and y position on the screen, it would be nice if instead of just printing out the old random numbers down here, well, x and y coordinates, I'd like actually to have it affect the screen itself. In life, when I actually click on these things down here, instead of just getting the x and y coordinates, I'd like to actually alter the corresponding grid square. Now, I'm going to have to do some mathematics to figure out how do I change this x into a grid square. So if I get out 80, how do I change that into whichever the grid square is? Because when I'm actually clicking here, if I click here, I want 4 to turn into 0, the 0 column. If I click here, if I get 95, I want that to be a 1 in the 1 column. Basically what I'm doing is I'm taking this x coordinate as I go across and altering it so that it changes into a 0 through 9 in our case. It's basically taking whatever the number is and dividing it by the width of my cells. So actually, this get width divided by the length of your cells is basically what I want. It's the same command both in the life panel and in life because they're the same size. So this is going to be very similar to what I had in the other one. So I'm going to figure out the width of a particular cell. Right here what I'm doing is I'm just figuring out width, taking the entire width of the panel, dividing it by the number of cells I have. Okay, so int width equals, in this side, it's named panel, dot get width, divided by however many cells I have. So cells 0, dot length, get width, cell 0 dot length. I'm not actually having to worry too much about rounding on this side, so I think I'm just going, well, no, I do have to worry about that now that I think about it. So this does need to be a double, and this also needs to be a double. Because the width of a particular cell in here might be like 45.5 pixels or something like that, and I would get an error as I went across otherwise. It's a similar thing for the height. Is double panel.get height divided by cells dot length. I'm using the length of my array, my two-dimensional array, because maybe at some point down the road I want to change this to be a 20 by 20, or even better, some sort of variable that I can actually put in and make my life panel however many cells I want it to. So that's why I'm keeping these as kind of generic figures rather than just putting the 10 in here. Okay, so once I have these things, how do I figure out the row and column? Well, it's going to be whatever my x value is divided by this width. And that's going to be my column in this case. X is actually the column I'm looking at. Now it's complaining because it's saying, hey, wait a minute, you can't convert from a double to an int just like this. I'm like, yeah, I know. So I'm going to take this whole thing and make it into an int. I might need to worry about truncating. We'll see in a second here. If that's the case, then if I want rounding instead, I'll just say math.round around this whole thing. The row is going to be the y position. So that's going to be an int event.getY divided by height. And while I'm here, let's go ahead and print out what it thinks the row and column are going to be. Just to double check I'm doing this right. So if I click here, 0, 0, that's 1, 0 going across, good. 2, 0, what if I'm near the edge? Still 2, 0, 3, 0, cool. 9, 0. Now, depending on how you did it, there is the possibility that you accidentally clicked just to the right of your last column. That will cause us all sorts of grief because that would make it an error. Now I could just make it that if the column is greater than 9, set it equal to 9, and do this in an if statement. That would be perfectly valid. Another way to do it is say, hey, give me the smaller of 9 and whatever this is. So what this does is, let's say that I get 0. What's smaller, 9 or 0? 0, of course. So you get back 0. Now, if you accidentally get a 10, though, because for whatever reason this rounds a little bit differently and you get a 10 out of this because you've clicked on exactly the right pixel, then it'll give you back, let's see, the smaller of 9 and 10 is 9. And so it'll keep you from going off the end of your array. I probably want something similar here. 9 and this. And actually, since I was just talking about being generic, what I probably should do is make this the smaller of cells 0 dot length minus 1 cells dot length minus 1. So this is basically to make sure you don't go off the end of your array. Just in case, because you never know what crazy people will do. Okay, so now that I have this row and this column, what do I do with it? Well, what I need to do is take whatever's in the current cell. If it's alive, for example, make it dead. And if it's dead, make it alive, so I can set up something at the beginning of my simulation. I could use a couple of if statements to do this, but there's an even faster way. What I can just say is cells, let's see, am I doing column or row first? When I'm drawing, I am doing nothing at the moment because I haven't put that in. So I actually need to make a decision now. I think that I will go row and then column. As long as I'm consistent, it doesn't matter, but I have to make sure that from now on, I always use row, column when I'm doing this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take whatever's currently in there and make it the opposite. The tricky way I do that is I assign it the value that it has and then say not, exclamation point at the beginning. That takes whatever's after it and makes it the opposite if it's a Boolean. So if this is true, this becomes false, and it assigns false. If this was false, it becomes true, and that goes into here. So this is a way to make it the opposite of whatever it currently is. Now, at the moment, I'm not actually drawing anything useful, so it's going to be hard to test whether or not this is working. So let's actually draw in the squares. I'm actually going to do this before I set the grid lines, so let's see. What's a good color for a square? How about blue? That seems pretty inoffensive. And next, I need to go through all of my squares and put them in. That seems like a for loop. And I'm going to go through by rows, and then I'm going to go through by columns. So my plan is basically go from left to right, top to bottom, like reading. Wait, I mentioned that earlier. Anyway, so now that I have that, keep in mind that cells is always, the columns is always cells zero's length. Columns is cells zero's length, and rows is always cells length. At least the way I've set it up here. I just need to make sure I'm consistent. So now that I've got my two for loops here, what I need to do is say, if the cell is alive, draw a box there. So if cells row column is true, two equal signs, column, then I need to draw a box. And in fact, what I need to do is I need to fill in a box, a blue one in this case. So I'm going to say g dot fill rectangle. Rect is the actual thing. So what this requires is an x position, y position, a width, and a height. So the x position is actually our column, which is 0 through 9, times however many cells over we are, times width. This, of course, gives us a double, because width is a double. So I need to change this to an int. Do that multiplication, then make it an int. Y is going to be a similar thing with row times the height.